Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I would just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today. I'm on Wurundjeri country, so would like to pay respects to Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and particularly pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as those with us tonight. I recognise their deep connection to the land, animals, and world around us. And so many of the animals that we're talking about tonight are of significant cultural importance. I'm Sally Sherwin, the Director of the Wildlife Conservation and Science team at Zoos Victoria. And we're so excited to be here tonight, shining a spotlight on a group of animals that is in urgent need of our attention. These animals we care so passionately about, and you're going to hear from some of the experts who have dedicated their careers to supporting the survival of so many incredible species. We're here tonight to talk about amphibians. There's a really interesting community attitude that surrounds the plight of this group of animals. As kids, we are deeply fascinated by them, searching for tadpoles in local creeks, admiring their unique lifestyle and quirky traits. But as we grow into adulthood, we can lose the focus and the attention on these animals that are less relatable to us humans. And we tend to have a very human-centric view of the world around us. So we ask questions like, what does that animal do for us? And why would we care if it goes extinct? So what we're here to do tonight is shine a spotlight on these incredible animals and flip that narrative to make sure that this undervalued group of animals can shine in their own right, not in a way that considers what they bring to us as the human species, but tell the stories of them as inherently important little beings as part of this bigger connected ecosystem. And through this, we can reignite our deep care for the world around us, just like traditional owners have always done and perceive the world around them. So our work at Zoos Victoria is dedicated to this mission. We want to share the wonder and awe we have for the world around us with our community and reignite the passion and the care for this species that is so important to the world around us. At Zoos Victoria, we have made a strong commitment to ensure no Victorian terrestrial vertebrate species will go extinct on our watch. And this commitment has been put to the ultimate test. There is no shortage of threats to the animals in our own backyard here in Victoria. And the bushfires we experienced in the 2019-2020 summers really evidenced this threat and this emerging threat of climate change. And if we don't rally further and adjust our attitude to the natural world around us and start to consider us as part of this system, we will continue to see more and more threats like this come and push species further to the brink of extinction. So tonight you're going to hear from 4 exceptional scientists who never lost the love and passion for these quirky animals and who have dedicated all of their careers to saving them. The conservation success stories that you're going to hear about tonight are examples of the power of partnerships in conservation and what can be achieved when we work hand in hand. We've got Dion Gilbert, Adam Lee, Matt West, and Nick Clement, all to share their own personal stories of working to save these incredible species. But before we throw to Dion, remember to put your questions in the chat box and we'll have time to answer them in a live Q&A at around 6:40 tonight. So to kick things off for us tonight, we've got Dion Gilbert, one of our threatened species biologists who specialises in threatened reptiles and amphibians. And he's been working with this incredible group of animals for over 20 years, regionally and internationally, and in particular with a focus on the Volvo Frog. So he's going to share some of these incredible stories with us tonight. Over to you, Dion.
Thanks for that, Sal. Hi, everyone. My name's Dion. I'm threatened species biologist for Zoos Victoria. And I've been working with threatened reptiles and amphibians for the best part of 20 years. So along with my colleagues tonight, it's great to be able to speak with you all. So I guess why are we all here? We're logging into yet another online meeting. And well, let's face it, things aren't exactly looking great. We're still in the middle of a global pandemic. Just share my screen. So we're still in the midst of a global pandemic, and the recent IPCC report forecasting a 1.5 degree temperature increase by 2030 is anxiety inducing. It hardly seems like a cause for celebration. But of course, that's not why you're here tonight. You're here because you want change, you want hope, and you want to do something about it. And hopefully the plight of amphibians is something that's close to your heart. And these massive global challenges are all induced by humans. And unfortunately, amphibians are right in the thick of it. Globally, we estimate there's over 7,000 species. And recent IUCN evaluation said that around 53% may be threatened with extinction. So to put that in context, that's almost 4,000 species. So I'm not sure about you guys, but I find that number absolutely staggering. So how do we actually do anything about these massive challenges like species extinction? For me, I think about it in the same way that I think about climate change. Think globally, act locally, and respond personally. And one way to stem the global amphibian decline is through the creation of conservation breeding programs. In many cases, they can be the difference between extinction and survival of a species. And that could not be truer for this stunning little beast, the Volvo Frog. The conservation story for this species has been decades in the making, but the wild population is still in peril and predicted to become extinct in the coming years. And it's still threatened by all the pervasive issues that have caused its decline. Disease, feral pests, human activity, logging, and of course, climate change. Despite this though, we've managed some small wins. And in this game, small wins are certainly worth celebrating. Slowly and with persistence, they add up, and that's what keeps me going. The conservation breeding program is now at the point of generating animals for experimental release back to wild sites. But these animals have all been reared and raised in a captive setting, and loss of wild fit traits and adaptation to captivity is a very real problem. And I'm pretty sure that over the last 18 months, we can all feel a little bit of sympathy for adaptation to captivity. After all, we want these frogs to be wild, we want them to be robust and wild fit, and under a changing climate, we may need to reintroduce them into areas of habitat that they weren't previously found in, but that models suitable under climate change in the coming years. Essentially, we want them to survive. So how do we know that we're on the right track? Are we just releasing lazy, well-fed animals back into the harsh reality of life in the wild? One way to test this is to monitor their activity. And we all know that this is a really effective way to learn about behaviour. By tracking their movement, we're able to see if they respond to their environment like wild frogs. And remarkably, these tiny little radio trackers have allowed us to do just that. It's allowed us to release and track and monitor 50 captive reared Volvo frogs. But I have to say that I feel a little bit too close to these animals after spending so long crawling around in the mud after them, day in, day out for weeks on end. But of course, for this to work, this sort of research to succeed, we really need to fix the problem. I'd like to give a big shout out to the Vic government and the Gary White Foundation for supporting this work, particularly while Zoos Vic was suffering the economic hit of COVID. And I very much appreciate everyone logging in. But to end my talk tonight, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a wrap up of what we got up to.
As part of this wild release of Volvo frogs, we're not just letting them go in the forest. We're actually going to monitor them and track them and see what they get up to once we release them. You're probably wondering how we track a little brown frog that looks like a piece of mud in a forest. Well, we've got these rad little radio receivers, little trackers that we've put onto the backs of the frogs using a little harness. Once we let them go, we can use radio receivers to track them. So we listen for the beep, find the frog, and see what they get up to.
Thank you, Dion. Those little Volvo frogs certainly are stunning little beasts. And I really like what you say there. Think globally, act locally, and respond personally. That is such an incredibly important and powerful statement for us to consider as we think through the rest of this seminar as well. So next up, we have Adam Lee, who's one of our specialist keepers, in particular for amphibian bushfire recovery programs across Zoos Victoria. Adam's been working with amphibians for over 10 years in a range of different roles, and he was actively involved in the response and recovery efforts from the 2019-2020 summer. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about some of the incredible work that's happened for the giant burrowing frog. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Sel. Yeah, it's really great to be here tonight. My name is Adam, and I'm one of the amphibian specialists at Melbourne Zoo. So together with Damien Goodall, we help to manage the endangered amphibian breeding programs at the zoo, which are currently the southern corroboree frogs, Volvo frogs, and the more recent addition of the giant burrowing frogs. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. There's a picture of one of our little giant burrowing frogs today. So my role is to focus on bushfire recovery species, and as part of this, we're currently in the process of building a new facility to support species that have been impacted by the bushfires. And I think the fires last year have really helped everyone to gain a bit more of an appreciation of the impacts of climate change, but also in a way how captive interventions, particularly in this context, have quite literally become a lifeline for a lot of these species. I think the other thing is as well, we're no longer working under the usual conservation timeframes of 5, 10, 20-year strategies. With these impacts, we're actually having to take a lot more drastic action and tailor some of our strategies to more so fit within the biological timeframes of the species we're trying to save. So I think personally for me, this became really clear in late 2019. I was working with Matt West, who's up next, so I won't steal any of his thunder. But I was working as a research assistant with Matt, helping to do some of the spotted tree frog surveys when the fires they really took off. With the fires, obviously a lot of the sites we wanted to get to became inaccessible, so the survey work actually transitioned more into impact assessments. And following that fire scar was really quite sobering, to be honest, to see that the destruction that kind of was there. It was around this time I was also involved with Zoos Vic other emergency efforts like the extraction of the eastern bristlebird. So for those that don't know, there's a small population out near Malakuta. It was surrounded by fire. So with the help of a whole host of agencies, we went in and extracted 15 birds to pull out to bring at the zoo. Until the threat had passed, but also if it did go through to potentially start a breeding program. So I think these two experiences in particular, they really help demonstrate not only the increased effects that climate change is having on threatened species, but yeah, the importance of these lifeline actions. So events like fire, they do have the very real potential of wiping out populations, and capturing genetics in time has never been more important, particularly when combined with the additional impacts of habitat loss and disease risks. Modern zoos have for a long time contributed to recovery of species through breeding programs, but these days they're just becoming critical. They're literally lifelines to some of these species, like the Volvo frog, that will likely soon be extinct in the wild, but even for things like the spotted tree frog to try and get genetics before it's too late. So one program I think that really kind of highlights success is the corroboree frogs. So Zoos Vic's been involved with this program for about 20 years now. And it really highlights what success looks like in terms of having an advanced program, a really solid knowledge base, as well as a thriving, genetically diverse and stable insurance population. The program itself is spread across multiple institutions, and it's got established genetic groups to maintain diversity, and some solid release strategies too. So things like protected field enclosures, release of varying life stages, and even more novel strategies like release into marginal habitat. Every year here at Melbourne Zoo alone, we're reliably producing over 1,000 eggs that are then released into some of these protected field enclosures on Mount Cossey. So with these increasing effects of climate change and this solid background of success with corroboree frogs, Zoos Vic added giant burrowing frogs to the list and has really extended another lifeline. The issue in this case comes from more of a time pressure to act in order to secure genetics for this species, but also to learn how to look after them in captivity in time without necessarily having that broader knowledge base that we would usually like to have to support a program like this. In essence, the giant burrowing frogs, it's in the critical rescue phase, and like a lot of conservation strategies, particularly these days, the appetite for risk is perhaps more than what we would usually accept, even when initiating new programs with cryptic species that have never been kept in captivity before. The wild collection, it really encapsulates this. You know, there was really good summer rains earlier this year, provided perfect conditions for some breeding events. And the original intention was to collect adults once we'd finished building our bushfire recovery centre, but this was a rare opportunity to collect tadpoles. So we scrambled, set up a makeshift facility, the fear being that the ponds would not last the winter and we could, you know, risk losing this entire little pocket. Even with all the rushing, by the time we got out there, some of the intended sites for collection had nothing left. But with luck on our side, we managed to pull out over 100 tadpoles to bring back to the zoo for rearing. The primary aim for now, with so many unknowns around this species, is to establish this husbandry and try and answer some of the many questions surrounding them. Things like what do they eat, how long until they sexually mature, can we breed them in captivity? The complexity surrounding amphibian husbandry are infinite. What the future will look like for recovery for this species is kind of is anybody's guess, but obviously the best course of action is to preserve the habitat they found. But with the pressure of climate change and, you know, unrelenting additional threats, that possibility is shrinking. So these realities are really forcing us to think outside the box for novel strategies to ensure these species survival. This program, it's in its infancy. There's a lot of unknowns, but for the moment it's looking good. We have thriving, developing tadpoles. Fingers crossed we can get them through the next few months as they metamorph. And the pressure is on with recovery programs in a post-Black Summer Australia as we try to establish kind of some of these conservation strategies for cryptic species, but under the constraints of their biological timeframes. That's it from me. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. I'll hand back to you, Sally.
Thank you, Adam. Just incredible stories about the giant burrowing frog and the work that's gone into saving that species. Next up, we have Matt West, who's a research fellow at the University of Melbourne. So Matt's an applied ecologist with a primary research focus on understanding and helping to protect threatened frogs. Matt's going to talk to us about the incredible work he's been leading to save the critically endangered spotted tree frog, in particular the threats that climate change are posing on this species. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Sal. We can all now appreciate the consequences of bushfire, floods and disease for human populations, and they also impact frogs. If you only take one message away from my talk tonight, it's that frogs, fire, flood and fungus don't mix, and as a consequence, frogs really need our help. It's not surprising that Australia's mammals, like koalas, are killed in bushfires, given that they live in highly fire-prone habitats and use highly flammable structures or parts of the landscape. But you may be surprised to learn that bushfires also kill frogs. After all, aren't frogs protected from fire because they live in or close to water? In 2019-2020, bushfires burnt more than 10 million hectares of Australia's forests, and researchers estimated that around 3 billion Australian vertebrate animals, including 51 million frogs, may have been affected. Frogs can't outrun or out-hop bushfires, but they can hide. If frogs choose a poor shelter site during a fire event, they can be killed due to heat stress and associated trauma and dehydration. And when frogs die during fires, this is known as a direct impact of fire. Frogs can also die after fires, and these are known as indirect impacts. For instance, frogs can be killed after fire if they're easier to be caught and eaten by predators, if there's less food around, if there's an increase in the incidence of disease, and if the fires or flooding events after fires affect the water bodies in which frogs live. Whilst the direct and indirect impacts of bushfire can be severe for individuals, we really want to know how the fires impact species at a population level. But the truth is, in most cases, we don't know because we're not doing enough monitoring. One of the species that we have been monitoring before and after fires is the critically endangered spotted tree frog. This species breeds in mountain streams in northeastern Victoria and the Kosciuszko area of New South Wales. In fact, we started monitoring this frog almost 30 years ago because it was one of many amphibian species that looked like they were starting to disappear in the 1980s and 1990s. The spotted tree frog has already disappeared from 50% of sites, is rare at all remaining sites, and is predicted to continue to decline unless we intervene. And habitat loss, predation by non-native fish species, and a disease caused by Cytrid fungus have all contributed to spotted tree frog population declines. To add insult to injury, the 2019-2020 bushfires also burnt 50% of the sites that spotted tree frogs use. A team from the University of Melbourne and the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning assessed the spotted tree frog populations after the fire event. We found that the fire severity at each of the remaining spotted tree frog sites varied from mild to severe intensity. And in addition, high rainfall after the fires washed ash and sediment and other debris into the mountain streams and caused flooding and black water events. These fires and floods also occurred at the time when the spotted tree frogs were trying to breed. And unfortunately, at most sites, there were very few surviving adult or juvenile frogs. To make matters worse, a high proportion of the surviving frogs were also found to be infected with Cytrid fungus. And some of these actually even died whilst we were there. This microscopic fungus is a huge problem for frogs, just like COVID is a huge problem for humans. Cytrid fungus has been attributed to around 500 species population declines worldwide. And unfortunately, we can't eliminate it from the wild, particularly from the mountain streams in which spotted tree frogs live. And we can't run around giving them immunisations either. Disease caused by Cytrid fungus is one of the main reasons why species like the spotted tree frog now have a low population resilience and are unable to cope with extreme bushfire events. The combined impact of bushfires and an increased incidence of disease are clearly accelerating spotted tree frog population declines. Fortunately for the spotted tree frog, help was at hand after the fires. We instigated an emergency salvage operation to collect some of the last remaining spotted tree frogs at sites. Melbourne Uni and Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning team went in to collect frogs so that we could establish a captive insurance and conservation breeding program at Zoos Victoria. We mostly collected juvenile frogs because these juveniles are very unlikely to survive in the wild, and we expect that they have a better chance of reaching adulthood in captivity. These captured frogs were taken to Hillsville Sanctuary to be part of the new breeding program where Zoos Victoria has committed to build specialised breeding facilities for the spotted tree frog using donations they received after the fire. Bushfires have a particularly devastating impact on frog populations that are small, isolated and exposed to other threats like Cytrid. Given the severity and intensity of bushfires is predicted to increase under climate change, urgent and sustained action is required to increase the resilience of frogs to future fire events before they disappear. The breeding program at Zoos Victoria will help achieve this, because when the frogs breed, their offspring will be released to increase the size of wild spotted tree frog populations. But we also need to manage the threats to frogs, and we are starting to tackle them in the wild. Zoos Victoria's new captive breeding facilities also provide an opportunity to find better ways to protect frogs from chytrid, and hopefully to find chytrid-resistant frogs that we can selectively breed for release to the wild. This is likely to be the next crucial step to increase the resilience of spotted tree frog populations to future fire events. And you can help by demanding stronger action on climate change to reduce future fire impacts, and by donating to help us find solutions to protect frogs from Cytrid fungus. That's all from me, and back over to you, Sal.
Thank you, Matt. Just amazing stories about the plight for survival for the spotted tree frog. And we're so excited to see the work that you'll bring to this species in the future. Next up, we've got Nick Clement, who's program leader for threatened fauna at the Arthur Rylah Institute. Nick's been leading programs on threatened wildlife for over 25 years and has a particular interest in the reptiles and frogs in the Alp region, in the Mallee and East Gippsland. So Nick's going to talk to us tonight about a range of different programs he's been working on and share some of the stories from these regions. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Sally, and I want to thank Zoos Victoria for making this event happen tonight. I think it's an important occasion. So I'm going to jump right in here, and I want to set the scene by saying that extinction itself is not unnatural. Over deep time, over the history of life on Earth, species have a finite existence. They either evolve or they go extinct. They don't stay the same. This means that we have what we call a background extinction rate in the fossil record. Over the history of life on this planet, there have also been several mass extinction events have occurred, including around 250 million years ago, the largest of all, the Permian, the Great Dying, when about 95% of species on the planet are believed to have been lost. And the literature tells us that we are now entering a sixth mass extinction event. And that's alarming, of course, but this one is different to the previous five. And the key difference here is that it's being caused by a single species, and that species is actually conscious of the problems it's causing. So if we look at what that means for Victorian frogs, in Victoria, we have around about 35 species, give or take, depending on taxonomy and discoveries and that kind of thing. Almost half of those species are listed as threatened, and that should be a real wake-up call to all of us. And in fact, not only do we have almost half of our frogs listed as threatened, we've already lost one from the state almost certainly. Now, I'm going to jump right into what some of the key drivers of why we're losing things. Now, a really obvious overarching first one is this loss of habitat. So if we look at the top left of the screen here, we see habitat being bulldozed at Mount Hotham Alpine Resort. Now, this is one of the handful of places where the frog bottom left, the alpine tree frog, persists. This little frog was once common right across the high country, and it now hangs on in barely a handful of spots. And in some of those places like Mount Hotham, its habitat is still being bulldozed today. If we look over the other side of the screen, we have this very cryptic giant burrowing frog that Adam spoke about earlier. This is a very hard to detect animal. We only know that it's persisting in a few locations. And top right there, we can see a patch of habitat in Far East Gippsland that was severely burned early last year in the Black Summer fires. Now, that patch of habitat is just above some streams where the frog was detected. And not long after the fires, that area was salvage logged. So not only was the area severely burned, it was also logged. And that's one of the few known populations of giant burrowing frogs. So what can we do about loss of habitat? Obviously, we've got to try and save what's left and connectivity between those. When it comes to frogs, we often only think about breeding habitats, aquatic areas, but frogs use much more habitat than that. We need to save those non-breeding habitats. We need to think, as Dion pointed out, that in the future, the frogs might need to be somewhere else because of a changed climate. We need to save those areas too. We cannot rely solely on detection for protection. Things like giant burrowing frogs, you miss them far more than you get them, even in areas where they are. So we need to protect the areas even when we don't detect them. So what we need to do is base that protection on the advice of the best frog experts. And by that, I mean sort of recovery teams, not some of the sort of self-proclaimed experts that have vested interests in this space. Okay, we've also talked a bit about climate, and while it's very, very difficult for frog biologists to do much about the changing climate at a local level, we need to think about the things that come with a changing climate, such as these fires. Now, we've already heard mention of the Code Red for Humanity announcements this week about climate change, and also last summer's Black Summer fires are very much in our mind. Now, one of the things that's often not understood about those fires is that not long after a fire, when we have these denuded landscapes, we often get big storms that then wash all this soil and ash and sediment into the stream channels, and that buries frog breeding habitats and frog shelter sites. That's a major problem, and a lot of that sediment in East Gippsland is still in those streams well over 12 months after the fires. So what can we do about this? First of all, we need to be monitoring frog populations before the fires. We can't quantify impacts if we have no pre-impact data. During firefighting exercises, we've got to prioritise critical habitats, but also those surrounding slopes to try and stop that sediment entering the frog habitats. We need to, when we're doing planned burnings, we need to think about frog and frog ecology and not just rely on other metrics such as botanical measures to decide how frequently we should burn. And when in doubt, we probably should err on the side of less fire rather than more. We also don't know much about the effect of firefighting chemicals on frogs and tadpoles, but we are beginning research on that now with some colleagues in Queensland. The next big threat, invasive species. And this one, it's pretty obvious. These are some pictures on the left here from my field survey cameras in the Alps. We can see deer there, and on the right of the screen, we can see the sort of damage that deer do to frog habitats. Bottom left, feral horses that are on subalpine plain in the Victorian Alps, and we can see again the damage that's done. But one that we rarely think about is this. Frogs and tadpoles obviously have an aquatic phase, particularly for the eggs and teddies. And there are another suite of introduced predators that are a problem there. And that is things like trout and redfin and introduced fish that eat in particular eggs and tadpoles. So what can we do about this? Obviously, we want to continue, increase and sustain current efforts on invasive species. Two of our speakers tonight, Dion Gilbert, Matt West, are doing amazing work with fishing groups, peak angling groups, and these people are now being recruited to help us try and save riverine frogs like the critically endangered spotted tree frog. We need to address resistance to some of the popular ferals like feral horses and sometimes deer, and try and encourage society to prioritise our threatened and declining natives. And of course, encourage people to protect habitat on private property. Another issue, another threat is questionable advice that is used to facilitate habitat destruction. So this is where the destruction of threatened frog habitat is proposed and apparent mitigations are put up to allow that habitat to be destroyed. Maybe habitat is created and the frogs are relocated to that habitat, or an underpass is put under. The problem is that most of the time these supposed mitigations seem to fail, and no other industry would accept that. So what can we do about it? Well, clearly, careful peer review, an independent peer review of advice is needed, and mitigation should be proven to actually mitigate before being used and before being used repeatedly. Now, disease, it's on our mind. Dion's done a great job of paralleling chytridiomycosis with the COVID crisis. And I'm not going to say a lot about this other than to say it's been in the news quite a bit this week, so it's still very much a live issue. And what I want to really emphasise about disease and frogs is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, okay? We've got frog populations suffering from disease, but they're also suffering because of climate change. And it's not just those two. Those two are big, wicked threats that are very, very hard for frog biologists to fix at a local level. But there's a whole range of other things that are affecting those populations that are also disease affected. And these are things that with enough political will and motivation, we can actually change. And I argue strongly here that if we're gonna have populations of frogs survive disease and climate change, we've really got to ease up these other threats to let them do that. So I'm just going to kind of wind up now with a couple of other critically important actions: survey and monitoring. When we monitor endangered frogs, we track trends in the population, we identify when we should intervene, but we also know when hands-off is the best approach because we're monitoring. We can ID emerging, worsening or easing threats, and we can understand what was happening to a population before big impacts like fires. This photo on the right here, a couple of our local frog heroes, Dion Gilbert, Damien Goodall, Adam Lee and Dr. Zach Atkins, one of my colleagues, here collecting those tadpoles for the giant burrowing frog program. And if you look at that little pond, that's what we're dealing with. You know, we got a dozen large teddies out of that tiny little pond, and those teddies were in strife. They were not going to survive the winter. So the important point about monitoring is that we have 16 species of frogs listed as threatened in Victoria. Only 3 of those are being monitored, and that's really not good enough for us to have our finger on the pulse. Captivity has already been spoken a bit about. It's critically important. It provides insurance. We can use captive frogs to augment wild populations. We can do reintroductions. We can conduct research on captive frogs. And captivity really gives us one of our best sources of information and our very last line of defence. So I want to wind up by just going back to the literature about this mass extinction event that we are causing and say, it's not over yet. It's not a foregone conclusion. We can still affect that in a positive way, but that window of opportunity is rapidly closing. We need to act now. Thank you all for having me here. I want to shout out to Tessie McLaughlin for making this happen under fairly difficult circumstances with lockdowns and all. And I'm going to throw back to you now, Sally. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Some really powerful messages associated with that presentation and the thinking that we can carry forward with us as humans, and knowingly contributing to the threats these species are facing, and time for us to step up and manage those. So before we throw to a special video treat we've got for you all tonight, I just wanted to take this opportunity to remind you to throw your questions in the chat box, and we'll be coming to answer these questions for you live after this video.
It's incredible. These tadpoles particularly are so big that I've been able to monitor the developmental stages of them really acutely. So every kind of bump and lump on them as it grows, I'm able to watch that and track it which is helping us kind of learn a lot about this species. These tadpoles are really charismatic. It's hard to think of that as a tadpole. They're ferocious eaters, that you can't feed them enough, and so constantly keeping the food up to them and watching their behaviours is really fascinating.
Just amazing, you guys. Thank you so much for sharing those stories and insights. It's just, I can't get over how exciting it is for us all to be here, dedicating an entire Wednesday night to all things frogs and these special creatures. So thank you all for being with us. And some incredible questions are coming through. I'm blown away by them. I don't think, we could be here for hours answering some of these, but we'll kick us off, you guys, with, I think, a few impressive ones that have come through. So, Dion, we might go to you first and ask you why you think we should care about amphibians. What's special about amphibians?
Thanks, Sal. That's a pretty common question, actually, when it comes to frogs. So as we sort of started off, I don't think I'll give you too many of the human-centric focused answers on that. I mean, frogs are important for a whole range of different things for humans. Painkillers, a whole bunch of medical purposes that have served humans well. But for me, I think they're really important as a sense of place. It's nighttime in Vic at the moment. It's pretty rainy and cold, but just about anywhere in the country, if you stepped outside, you'd probably hear frogs calling. So they're a really important part of the soundscape and just, a feeling of nature. And, without that, it's sort of akin to me to losing something during the day, like a kookaburra's call or a cockatoo or something like that. They're a really intrinsic part of the Australian soundscape. So I think without frogs in their environment, we just lose that really important part of us. And then I guess, like you touched on at the start, we lose that curiosity. What sort of animal starts as a jelly egg mass and then at some point becomes a vertebrate hopping around on land? It's pretty incredible. So personally for me, I spent, and still do, my childhood and adulthood, looking at tatties and frogs, and rightly so, that curiosity should stick with us all the way through our lives. I think we'd be better off for it.
Great answer, Dion. I think that's a great call to action for all of us as well, that soundscape and bringing us back to that connection to place as well. We could all go off and download some frog, I think, ringtones for our phones, just to remind us of the importance of those if we can't find the time to get out and about in nature. This one, Matt, I reckon is a good one for you. All about climate change, and you touched on this in your presentation. So with climate change impacting so many different species of amphibians, what will this mean for the species you work with?
Thanks, Sal. Climate change is already impacting amphibians because they're highly sensitive to changes in weather patterns requiring specific cues for breeding, growth, and development. For example, the timing and duration of rainfall is particularly important for frogs' breeding activity. Species like the newly described and threatened Watson's tree frog breed in puddles, and their eggs and tadpoles will die if those puddles dry up before the tadpoles become frogs. The increasing temperatures caused by climate change will make it harder for range-restricted species, especially those at the tops of mountains, because when it gets too hot, species like the elegant tree frog and the Volvo frog, they've just got nowhere else to go. And as I've mentioned tonight, bushfires are increasing under climate change, but so are other extreme weather events like drought. Frogs like the giant burrowing frog can cope with drought for short periods, but at some stage they need water. So long periods of drought make it very hard for species to breed, and they also reduce the availability of food for those species as well, the insects that they require. Therefore, in extreme drought conditions, it's a big risk that adults will die before they get a chance to breed. And climate change is predicted to influence the way that disease the way that chytrid fungus influences frogs. Some frogs may be better off because the current strain of chytrid doesn't like hot conditions, temperatures above 27 degrees Celsius, but chytrid chytrid risk will increase for other species when conditions at sites become more favourable for chytrid. But the strain of chytrid might also adapt. And I've seen a few questions on the chat about that tonight as well. Because, the bottom line is that climate change is a massive problem for frogs because it's just one of many threats that frogs face. When you add all of these threats together, frogs are running out of time.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And just on that, there's been a few questions come in that while we're touching on the chytrid fungus, a few questions around one from Helen. What causes the fungus?
Well, the chytrid fungus originated from Southeast Asia, as far as we know. That's where the genetic evidence points to at the moment. So it's an introduced disease, just like COVID is introduced for us here in Australia as well. It's a fungal pathogen, and as I've said tonight, it's believed to have driven at least 500 species declines throughout the world, including several extinctions of species. Wow,
thank you, Matt. Adam, I reckon we'll throw to you for this one. We've got a couple of questions for you here. From Kayleen, what is the difference between a frog and a toad? Great question.
Yeah, pretty common one, the difference between a frog and a toad. But yeah, there's not too much difference, like in terms of what they do and how they live. But yeah, mostly kind of a skin kind of thing. Toads have a lot more lumps and bumps, but yeah, so do frogs.
Right, so we need you guys as the experts to jump in and help ID it all for us.
Yeah.
And Adam, talk us through, you mentioned a lot in your presentation, all of the different elements of a program that need to fit in place to deliver on the conservation gains. Talk us through, what you think are the key ingredients to designing a successful conservation program.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ingredients in all of these kind of conservation programs, I guess. I think the thing we can kind of see from tonight, for example, is that collaboration is probably the biggest one. When you think about some of these recovery programs, it's not any one person or any one organization kind of doing it. There's a lot kind of inputted into it. And that's what recovery programs are essentially. They're multi-stakeholders that kind of come together to kind of with a single outcome to try and kind of improve species in the wild. Yeah, I mean, the giant burrowing frogs, for example, it was, discovered by Danielle Wallace from Melbourne Uni. She was doing DELP surveys, and then kind of ARI came in with Nick and Zach and took us out there, and then we grabbed some tadpoles, we've brought them back, and then we're building a new facility with Bushfire funds, which is donations from everyone. So it's a massive kind of, it's just everybody coming together to kind of really make these programs work, I think. That's the biggest ingredient.
Yeah, spot on, the partnerships and the rallying together, even just events like what we've got tonight to foster this interest and fascination for these incredible animals. Nick, we might throw to you, I think, here. We've got a good one around what you think. You mentioned a lot about monitoring and population monitoring for all of these species or lack thereof. Talk us through why that's so important.
Thanks, Sal. It's a great question. After when we get big events like we had last summer, these Black Summer fires, the very first thing on everyone's mind is what is the impact? Once we've dealt with the human catastrophe, it's what's the impact on these species? And we go in very soon after the fires, we go in and we try and answer that. But it's much harder to answer that going in after a fire with no pre-fire information. I think Matt West has done a brilliant job of demonstrating the value of pre-impact monitoring. And as I said, we've got around 15, 16 threatened frogs in Victoria, and only less than a handful of those are being monitored. And so we don't have, our ability to answer that question of what the impact was is really, really limited. And it means that if we try and respond, if there are no frogs there after a fire, there are a few frogs, does that mean that the fire knocked them down? Does it mean that they were already knocked down by Cytrid beforehand? Has drought played a role? Monitoring is a really important investment in that kind of knowledge base, and it allows us to make very wise, very cost-effective decisions. And it means that we can track over time. I mean, we can go to Matt West. We've done this. I remember Matt doing spotted tree frog post-fire surveys after the Black Saturday fires in 2009. Matt can now tell us, 10, 12 years after those fires, what the long-term effects were as well as what the short-term effects were. There's no question that we need to be investing more in monitoring more of these species. We can't monitor everything, but we can certainly monitor more than we currently are.
Great, Nick. Yeah, really key takeaway, I think. And I'm thinking we might have a lot of young Zoom members or interested people here, and that might be a bit of a call to arms for anyone thinking about studying, science at uni and biology. Continue to foster that interest. Get in there. We need a future army of scientists out there monitoring these species. And that leads to the next question, Nick. I think while we've got you is about what can people do? What this component of, we call it sometimes citizen science. So having people involved in recording and monitoring animals for us. So there's a great question here from and beyond just the monitoring component. What can we do to encourage frog-friendly habitats and at home in our backyard? So Isla and Debbie in particular, wanting to know more about, firstly, how can they see and know that frogs are there? And then how do they set up a really frog-friendly habitat in their own backyard?
Okay, well, firstly, maybe before they see them, they might hear them for starters. So that's an obvious one, is that these frogs have these wonderful acoustic repertoires that Dion spoke beautifully about earlier. I think, to get frogs in your backyard, you've got to have frogs nearby to begin with. And so part of what needs to, the backyard's great, and creating habitat there is good, and complexity and wet areas and places with lots of inverts and things where frogs can shelter, frogs can eat, but also advocating, as Dion spoke about, advocating for local habitat protection. And that's going to be the source for any of what we can do in our backyards. And so, I mean, a full rundown of what you might do to create frog habitats a bit beyond the scope of what we've got time for now. But I would say, yes, try and create them, but also try and preserve what's existing, especially locally, because that's going to be your source population, and that's going to really help.
Thanks, Nick. And I know there's plenty of sites that that are up that give really good advice on how to create a nice little frog bog in the backyard. Dion, there's a few questions coming in. There's a lot of interest in the Volvo Frog, which I'm sure you'll be thrilled to hear. Is the Volvo Frog from Eugenie? Is the Volvo Frog the biggest frog in the world?
Certainly the best. Biggest probably not though. No, they're probably, you know, at maximum, you know, maybe 60, 65 millimeters long. But
yeah.
What they lack in size definitely make up for in attitude and boldness. That's pretty tough.
And from Luke Eaton, who is one of our previous Young Hall of Fame winners at Zoos Victoria, who's a fighting extinction warrior that is just no limits to his interest in conservation, which is just great. Luke wants to know, how many Volvo frogs have we bred and then released to the wild, Dion?
Okay, that's a good one. So we've been focusing our release efforts almost solely up until last year on trying to figure out how to get eggs and tadpoles back to the wild. So Volvo frogs breed completely and mate actually underground, so everything happens in total darkness. They've been trying to figure out ways to get captive bred eggs back to the wild. So experimentally, at least, we've probably released in the order of around about 500 eggs and tatties with pretty good survivorship through to metamorphosis. So we've been able to create these artificial egg laying sites that their eggs are released to. So that gives them some extra protection in the wild. So the ones that we release that have been fertile, the vast majority of them are developing through metamorphosis, which is good. But, you know, when they become little 2 millimeter long Volvo frog babies, it's up to them to survive in the wild on their own until they grow up into adults. And then last year, of course, we released the 50 adults that were also captive reared, and those animals were the ones that were part of the radio tracking work. So we'll continue to do that over the coming years and decades. Great,
Dion, thank you. Matt, quick one for you about the indirect impacts of bushfires and smoke. How has there been any research into the smoke impacts on amphibians in addition to just the direct fire?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure there has been any specific research on that subject yet. There's maybe one of the other panelists. Nick, have you heard of anything?
Not that I'm aware of, nothing specific in terms of smoke impacts on amphibians, and maybe one of our young will-be zoologists can make a PhD out of that at some point in their career.
Great tip, Nick. I think we've got a few questions. I can see one from Toby wondering how we can, and Kate, how can they help, and you know, as young teenagers, how can they continue this work? So I think you guys have highlighted a few areas for future research. So no shortage of that. I'm just looking at the time. Like I said, we could have done this for hours, but we better start wrapping up. Just a final quick one for all of you. If you had one key message for all of those here with us tonight about conservation, mitigating climate change, what can we do, our bit in this world, to help these incredible animals? So let's start with you, Adam.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing we've got to do at the moment is just protect what we've got, and that's kind of doing what we can in our own personal way in terms of, you know, energy use and all that sort of stuff, but then also making sure the government helps us protect it too, because we can only do so much as an individual.
Matt, do you want to jump in? What's your takeaway?
That's a good question, Sal. Look, I mean, I think we probably might be preaching to the converted tonight. I think most people tuning in tonight would be very supportive of the work that we're doing, and we certainly very much appreciate your support. Do everything you possibly can. There are multiple ways in which you can help as an individual, but also you can vote to support action that contributes to stronger laws to protect wildlife and stronger action on climate change. And if you're able to, you can support the research that we're doing in other ways as well.
And Dion, some words of wisdom from you.
Yeah, I think everyone's sort of, perfectly sort of summing it up, but, everything from what you can do at home. But I think tackling the big problems has to come from us, but also picketing and lobbying the pollies as hard as possible. They're under a little bit of pressure at the moment with COVID, but to be honest, who cares? They're, six-figure salaries, and I think we should be lobbying for climate change, stronger protection on wildlife, and make them really work for those sort of salaries and push them really hard.
Great, thank you all. Some really good snippets of information and what we can all do to do our bit in this bigger world. My I think key words of wisdom from my end is something that, particularly in COVID lockdown, that I think is helpful in us as we process what's going on in the world around us, is to get out there and reconnect with nature in our own backyard. And the emotion that is awe is incredibly powerful and contagious as well. And I think amphibians are a group of animals that can really trigger awe in us because they are so unique and so incredibly different to us, and inspire a lot of that curiosity. So get out there in nature, reconnect, and try and find that awe for the world around us. So that brings us to the end of today's session. I want to close by thanking our event partners in particular. So Inspiring Victoria, has been incredible to have this on as part of Science Week. All the amazing donors and supporters that have allowed us to do this work is just a huge thank you to everyone and our partners in that context, and also to you for and all of the teams and people that work around you for dedicating your time to talking about these incredible animals, but also I think all the work you do day in, day out to fight for these species that do need a spotlight at times like this. So we're gonna say goodnight for tonight, but please keep your interest and love for amphibians flowing, and we will head out with a final video about another special amphibian to send us off for tonight. Thank you all for being with us.
Just over to the right of me here, there's natural sphagnum bogs where corroboree frogs breed, and we've set up these artificial tubs so we can release the eggs into these tubs, and they'll see through winter, so they'll freeze over, so there'll be a big thick layer of ice, but the tadpoles will actually survive underneath that ice. Come spring, they'll start metamorphing, and they can actually crawl out of these tubs and then crawl back into their natural habitat.